Welcome to the Weekly Wrap with me, Luke Daniel and Connor Tomlinson. This week we're going to be talking firstly about discussion which happened on the Joe Rogan podcast between Douglas Murray and Dave Smith, and sort of asking the question whether there's a tendency of commentators in alternative media to maybe take things too far and sort of undermine their cause. We'll talk about the Islamification of prisons, Birmingham bin strikes and sort of as a product of the Equality Act, and two-tier policing and the Home Affairs Select Committee report, which is in response to the topic. Firstly, Douglas versus Dave Smith. I'm not sure if any of the audience has watched this, but they should. It was quite an interesting sort of watch. So Dave Smith, he's a comedian. He's a podcaster. He's a libertarian. He's been on Joe Rogan shows a number of times, and Douglas Murray was on with him. And Douglas launched immediately into this criticism that some of the people who are on Joe Rogan's show, who are maybe on the right, who are maybe sort of advancing sort of theories on history, particularly sort of the reputation of Churchill, World War II revisionism, potentially Holocaust revisionism. And he was sort of worried that they are too enthusiastic with some of their critiques and therefore sort of undermine basically the position of the West, and maybe they get things wrong. You know, they're not necessarily experts, was the phrase that he used. I've always taken umbrage with this idea of the woke right, which is, I think, something that's been pushed by people like Jamie Lindsay, because it seems to be sort of a veiled attack on essentially Christian conservatives. But there is a tendency, I mean, you might not agree, but it seems like there is a tendency among some commentators to sort of hack away at certain theories of history, certain ideas of history, while they're criticizing sort of elites in the West, in this country, in the US, who've got us into some of the position we're in now. They sort of simultaneously hack away at some sort of central, important parts of our history and sort of undermine some institutions which are important. So I wonder if what your take on that conversation was, and whether you think that is the case, or, you know, was Douglas Murray, did he go in all guns blazing? Was he too harsh? What's your thoughts?
So I've watched it about 3 times because the Douglas Murray and Dave Smith debate is so enjoyable. However, from the outset, I will say that I think Dave Smith is a good faith actor. He is not just reducible to being a comedian. He is a member of the Libertarian Party, and people thought that whether or not the Libertarian Party has any chance in hell of ever getting elected, he was a viable candidate to put forward for president rather than Chase Oliver, who represents a very unpopular and thin sliver of the left wing of the Libertarian Party, hence why Douglas calls them political bisexuals in the podcast. And so Dave Smith is educated and he is engaging in the debate in good faith. The phenomenon Douglas was highlighting was that there are people who either get facts wrong, like Daryl Cooper about Churchill, which Andrew Roberts and Victor David Hanson have written extensively on refuting individual items of that, or who engage in admitted hyperbole in Daryl Cooper's case by saying that Churchill was the true villain of World War II. I think that's incorrect, not least of all because by his own criteria, when he was discussing that with Tucker Carlson, they said, look at the net impact of Churchill's legacy. Britain doesn't feel like Britain anymore. And as someone who lives here, per Douglas's rule of only speaking in countries that you visited, that is true. Britain doesn't feel like Britain anymore. But if you transported Churchill through time and showed him Britain today, he would be on the so-called far right, because he would be very unhappy with what was done, and he did not intend things like the 1952 UN Refugee Convention or the European Convention on Human Rights to apply to anyone except Dutch Jews, and certainly not Albanian illegal migrants and Ghanaian sex offenders who can't be evicted because their kids don't like foreign chicken nuggets. Right? That's not what Churchill intended. A lot of Douglas's critiques, because he went in very hard off the back, centered around the term expert. And I think his mistake was using the term expert to be synonymous with credible. Because ever since the COVID era, all of us have a Pavlovian response to the notion we should trust experts, because nobody has done more to discredit the use of listening to expertise than the experts that the state has appointed because they align with their broader ideological goals. I'm thinking Anthony Fauci, for example, who misrepresented the fact that he was funding gain-of-function research via Peter Daszak and the EcoHealth Alliance at the Wuhan lab, who admitted that he lied about the efficacy of masks. Originally, he said it's not going to stop anything, and then he said it's absolutely going to stop COVID, even though that wasn't the case. And he said, well, we had to tell the media that so that all of the PPE equipment wasn't bought up by citizens when we needed it at a hospital. So he admitted that he was misrepresenting this. He was censoring folks like Jay Bhattacharya and Dr. Carol Sikora, who had drafted the Great Barrington Declaration, which was going to be the selective shielding model of combating pandemics rather than widespread lockdowns. And he had coordinated within the CDC plans to try to discredit them publicly so that they could push lockdowns without any opposition. So all of these things during the COVID era made it so that experts were untrustworthy. And so to say we need more experts around as a solution to the errors put out by the likes of Darryl Cooper, whose motivations I'm not going to try and read like tea leaves. He could just be mistaken. He could be a bad faith actor. I don't know. I've never met him. But to counteract those mistakes, yes, more debate is always a good thing, and Darryl Cooper has refused to do so. But just saying we need experts here is not the way to go about it, because who determines expertise? Is it credentials afforded by the same sorts of universities that Douglas has brilliantly critiqued in Madness of Crowds and War on the West? Is it track record of correct predictions? Because like Douglas, though I do, he's a bit of an intellectual hero of mine, but I think he got elements of COVID wrong. He got elements of January 6th wrong. He supported the Iraq War, and I think, they were at least led into the country under false pretenses. So what determines expertise or what determines credibility? That was not laid out. And so using the term expert to be synonymous with credible was his great mistake there. But I do think Douglas is right when he said to Dave, you have a lot of opinions about Israel specifically. And Douglas can claim to have a lot of credibility on Israel. I've just reviewed his new book on democracies and death cults for Courage Media. And while I am neither Jewish nor have any connection to Israel greater than I do Iceland, it's a useful book because you can realize the genocidal ideology that is within Hamas that is laying dormant all across the West now because of mass immigration and multiculturalism, and how unexpectedly a massacre can flip your civilization on its head overnight, and how Israel took the side of its people, and there's a very real fear that our governments will not necessarily take the side of ours under DEI laws and all this sort of thing. What Douglas is saying is that he has spent time in Israel. He has interviewed people on the front line. He's interviewed politicians. He's interrogated the claims presented to him. And so he can claim credibility because he has not done his own research. He's done research on behalf of a lot of other people who can't get out there. And for Dave to then make the claim that, for example, Gaza is an open-air concentration camp, or it bears a lot of characteristics of a concentration camp, when he's never visited the region, when he doesn't know the scale of these blockades that he was saying were so damaging, when, yes, he has been presented with lots of images of human suffering from Gaza, but he perhaps doesn't realize that lots of those buildings were leveled because booby traps, bombs, and weapons caches were disarmed using bits of technology, and Hamas was embedding all of those explosives in schools, hospitals, and residential areas, hence the devastation. Lots of those things that he doesn't realize, he doesn't know them because he hasn't been there and done the legwork that Douglas has. So it's not that lived experience has a greater premium than someone's ability to be independently informed by doing lots of research and reading primary sources. But it does mean that if you go out there and do first-hand research, you can claim to have credibility on an issue. You're not necessarily an expert, but you have credibility in a field. And that's what I think Douglas was right about, and I think Dave was wrong to dismiss that as a fallacious argument.
So it's kind of this distinction between sort of expertise and good learning versus credentialism.
Yes.
If you're, reading a work of history and you're dealing with an historian who's been in the archives with the primary sort of source material versus somebody who's talking about what somebody has said, then obviously the better work of history, most likely, is the guy who's done the original archival research
and that's
been with the sources.
That's the issue that's raised with Daryl Cooper. He has tweeted before that he's read David Irving's books and he thinks they're good sources. Now, David Irving makes a number of errors that historians like just Tick History on YouTube have pored over and put side by side with other sources and corrected. And he's made those in his work. So if you're not doing first-hand archival research and you're relying on a lot of second-hand historical testimony, and then you don't compare and contrast different historical accounts, like other historians work with Irving's, you might end up believing one account that is filled with errors, and you don't know what errors it's filled with because more up-to-date history might have already corrected those. And I think that's the point being made, right?
Yeah, and I guess the interesting thing about David Irving, for example, is that he actually does hold a lot of the sort of archive and source material.
On Dresden,
and,
yes.
And diaries, but a lot of the historians who actually use those materials, come to different conclusions, and there is a large degree of consensus against what he says and what his arguments are.
The idea that Hitler was downplaying his anti-Semitism, for example, that's just inaccurate.
No, he wrote a whole book on it.
Yeah, he wrote it in the 1920s. He was giving internal party speeches.
Which then became the Bible for the Nazi Party.
Even if you dispute the veracity of certain passages in table talks, he wasn't hiding that he was having these conversations with the internal Nazi Party apparatchiks. And then we do have the transcripts of his speeches. He was not restrained in his belief that capitalism and communism were both conspiracies by Jews to collapse the world economy and cripple everyone who wasn't Jewish. So even if he's just using terms like global capitalism or global communism, he's using them as dog whistles for a broader Jewish plot. So he wasn't hiding it. And so wherever Daryl has garnered that claim from, again, I'm not trying to attribute ill motivations to Daryl. Wherever he's garnered that claim from, it's inaccurate. And so if you're relying on second-hand accounts, or even one interpretation of the primary sources that isn't contrasted with other interpretations, then you might get things wrong. And so then this comes back to the point about who you platforming, who you consulting as credible. If, as Joe he has had on Daryl Cooper, and then has not followed up with someone else like Neil Ferguson, for example. Andrew Roberts, Victor Davis Hanson, who'd be a great guest on Rogan's show, actually. Then he is failing to expose his audience to either a correction or a counter-narrative. He's not mandated to do that, by the way, but Douglas's point was, look, the reason the mainstream media has exhausted their credibility is because they didn't do that. They became anti-Trump partisans for ages. They weaponized Joe Rogan's COVID diagnosis by graying out his face on CNN to make him look more ill than he actually was. Like that's totally absurd. So Joe Rogan and podcasters like Dave Smith, sometimes like me, maybe, definitely at the same scale of audience, they take on more credibility than the establishment, formerly mainstream media. And so you do have an onus to ensure that you try and get things right, that you try and have a bit of balance.
But then I guess then there's this broader discussion that you have this establishment media, you have the sort of established opinion, and the reason someone like Joe Rogan has become so successful is because he has, over a number of years, platformed people who have sought to raise interesting questions about what the consensus has been, right?
Yes.
And that is why he's popular. So I guess he doesn't necessarily view his role as somebody who he hasn't traditionally viewed his role as somebody who needs to sort of balance two sides of an argument, because he still thinks that there is an established narrative and there are these people around who are just asking questions. And I think Douglas's point is that there's a danger that when it comes to bringing on comedians of sorts, that they can say, well, I'm just asking questions. They can put forward an idea which is potentially dangerous or potentially misleading, and then when they are rebuffed, can say, well, I was just asking questions.
It's
I'm just a
Bailey.
comedian. Yeah, exactly. It's a Mon Bailey tactic. And I wonder whether, people like Joe Rogan, people in alternative media now have to reckon with the fact that actually they are an extremely popular source for opinions, for news, and they're no longer just countering an established narrative. They're actually helping create an environment where serious discussion over complex issues and ideas about history are occurring. So, maybe now is the time for someone like Joe Rogan to consciously platform people who are potentially in disagreement. I thought it was interesting that he had both of them on at the same time.
Yes.
And
it was valuable.
Yeah.
And I think I'm not going to try and tell Joe how to run his show, but based on Joe's long-standing commitment to seeking the truth and risking offending people by asking uncomfortable questions in order to pursue that, I think if you're met with, or if one of your guests is met with a large amount of criticism and you then don't follow up on that, especially when that guest is proven to have gotten something factually wrong, I think that is a wavering of commitment to the truth. The criticism I will have of Douglas's approach to this is that Douglas seemed very concerned with the second order effects of platforming these people at all. And I agree with Douglas when he says we should be talking about the primary things rather than the secondary things, as politics often does. So, for example, when Dave Smith mentioned in the broader conversation about neoconservatism and the intervention in Ukraine, which I happen to side more with Dave on than I do Douglas on this issue, when Dave brought up Paul Wolfowitz as someone who is interested in waging wars of regime change abroad, Douglas became concerned that people who weren't Dave, who himself is Jewish, could take the name Wolfowitz and run away with it and make anti-Semitic conspiracy theories out of it. And I would say that the same accusation is often spuriously made of Douglas by saying, oh, look, here are all these members of the Muslim Brotherhood. Here are all these organizations they decide to fund. Here are all these people that work for those organizations that then soft pedal terrorism, like Hizb ut-Tahrir. And then someone will come along and say, well, you're focusing so much on Muslims. Don't you just really hate them? Aren't you spreading Islamophobic conspiracy theories? Itself a phrase invented by the Muslim Brotherhood. I would just say that, it is not Dave Smith's responsibility if a bunch of anonymous grippers on Twitter decide to make a straw man out of a substantive argument retroactively. And I think that Douglas is right to be concerned about the growth of unchallenged insanity, especially in an environment that rewards sensationalism with monetization on X.
Partly because then it flips all the way back round, and then you have this whole roster of people who've said misleading things, which then can be leveled against people on the right in general.
Yes.
Right? Which is a tactic that the left or the liberal establishment is very keen to do.
Yes,
to use.
But that's not Dave and Joe's fault. And then the final point on the woke right, it's a phrase that doesn't make sense because woke has a very specific meaning. Eric Kaufman has defined it as the sacralizing, making sacred, of racial, sexual, and gender minority groups. And then he said all sorts of cultural socialism prescriptions to redress their grievances come downstream from that. I default to self-proclaimed literal communist Ash Sarkar on this one, herself being chronically woke. And she says woke culture is the redistribution of power, wealth, land, I'll add recognition to this as well, along class, race, gender, and sexuality lines. So it's gay race communism. Woke is gay race communism, and there is no gay race communism on the right unless they are masquerading as being right-wing because the left left me, but actually agreeing with everything, all of the stages of the leftist resolution except the last one, which, frankly, someone like James Lindsay, who's peddling the phrase woke right, does.
Yeah, well, I suppose part of his argument is that there's a group of people who are overly censorious, who want to sort of police the boundaries of acceptable thought on the right. I
think it's the inverse,
that's exactly what he's doing. He just doesn't like that they're policing it in a different way than he is.
Yes.
So he's sort of come up with a term for it. Okay, so I guess that sort of maybe gives me the answer to the next question. But Piers Morgan quoted you on his show, I think, last night.
He didn't quote me. I don't know who he quoted.
Well, apparently you were saying Douglas absolutely smashed it, but clearly your view is a bit more nuanced on that. So
Piers Morgan quoted a tweet that said that Douglas Murray destroyed ignorant Dave Smith, and he said it came from me, and I just didn't tweet that. I didn't. Now, again, I think Douglas made valid points about being credible, not about being experts. I side with Douglas on the Israel issue in that, as he says in his book, if October the 7th were to happen in our country, our government coming to our defense in a capacity any less than the Israeli government came to the defense of its own people is an indictment not of the Israelis but of our government. And as we've seen with the continued cover-up around the rape gang trial, something comparable to October 7th has happened for decades in the UK, and our government's betrayed us, whereas the Israeli government has defended them. And as far as Dave goes, I think he makes cogent arguments about Ukraine, and I don't think he needs to have visited Ukraine to make that argument, actually, because the bellicosity of our leaders trying to deploy troops on the ground from Europe and the US into Ukraine, Europe first, of course, but NATO more broadly, and their subsidy of the conflict using American taxpayer and UK taxpayer dollars and pounds means that we do actually have a stake in this, even if we haven't been to the land, because it will be you and me, mate, that get called up for the draft. And I'm not keen to defend a liberal international rules-based order which has failed on almost all of its foreign policy ventures since being instituted. And when we're critiquing Vladimir Putin, quite rightly, for incarcerating and assassinating his own political opposition, but my own government is arresting 12,000 people a year, more than pre-war Russia, which don't have statistics on how many they do now, but more than pre-war Russia, for speech violations. So we are acting in a very similar way while calling ourselves liberal and democratic. I don't want to fight to defend that order. I don't want to fight to defend an order that discriminates against me as a white man from hiring in state institutions and demonizes me culturally as everything wrong with civilization. I don't want to fight to defend that. So I think that Dave is perfectly entitled to have his critiques of the interventionist foreign policy, both in Ukraine and in the Middle East, because he's spending money on it, and it'll be his kids and you and me that will be called up to fight for it.
This is a deviation slightly, but I don't think maybe we should talk about this at length separately. But I do wonder, do you have a sort of grudging sense that if we did end up at war, you would sort of step up and do your duty, even for, or are you completely checked out? Would you be completely checked out?
Who are we going to war with? For what? If we were invaded, and we are
with Russia,
we're being invaded,
which I don't want, by the way.
No, no.
To make that very, very clear.
I have no appetite to go and shoot at some poor Russian conscript who's also being forced into the front lines by his own dictatorial government. But we are currently being invaded across the channel. We've got record number of channel crossings. As we spoke about last time, Eritreans and Afghans are 20 times more likely than the British man to commit a sex offence against our women and girls. Are we allowed to do anything about that? No, we're forced to pay for it for an escalating cost. And if we complain about it, we're called far right and racist. So, would I defend my country were it being invaded in a military capacity? Yeah, because I defend my home and my family and all the roads and little comforts I know. Would I enlist or comply with conscription to go overseas to fight for the rules-based international order when it's neither liberal nor democratic? No thanks.
So there really is a distinction between being shipped out overseas to sort of defend the periphery, or I guess the centre of Europe, as opposed to sort of fighting on the beaches, fighting on the landing grounds if some fleets rocked up at the shore. Okay. I guess just lastly on that point, I think it'll be very interesting to read your review of Douglas Murray's new book, which is coming out soon on Courage.
It should already be out by the time this episode is out.
Okay, perfect. So everybody go and read that, and then obviously go and read Douglas Murray's book. I'm also interested to read that as well.
It is very good.
Is it good? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Good.
People who have been frustrated with Douglas's interventionist foreign policy will still read the book and get a lot out of it, because the warning is not about taking more interventionist measures abroad. It's about looking at our own civilizations and seeing the rot within. Because if Hamas was able to lie quiet for 20, 30 years and build a tunnel network under Israeli schools, hospitals and homes that is larger than the London Underground network, to embed their operatives in like yard work jobs so that they could scope out all of the homes of Israelis and which one had a safe house. If they could stockpile weapons and misappropriate UN funds and hide rockets under the cribs of children and tunnel through their own hospitals and use their own people as human shields, do we really doubt that people that share their ideology couldn't work their way into our institutions? And that is a seriously chilling thought, because we've had a lot of discourse, not from swivel-eyed loons and accelerationist racists, but from the likes of David Betts and Tim Stanley, and even Inaya Falarin Iman now, who criticised me for saying that there's some anti-white racism and she's now changed her mind on it, about ethnic conflict and civil war. And as I've said, when Hamas attacked Israel, Israel sided with its people. If that ideology, sympathetic to Hamas, is embedded in our institutions to the extent where the BBC, the state broadcaster, gets the son of a Hamas official to narrate a documentary it does about the plight of the Palestinians, if they so sympathise with the terrorists, what's to say that when that flare goes up, the state will be standing on the same side as us? That is the lesson from Douglas's book. It's utterly chilling, but you should definitely read it.
Yeah, and it's worth clarifying that that documentary was withdrawn when they sort of realised, but the point still stands that the fact that it's even possible to get to this position when people kicked up a fuss,
complained about it.
But yeah, so the point stands that within our institutions, people with subversive ideologies are more than capable of infiltrating. On a sort of similar topic, I think we should talk about the Islamification of prisons. I wanted to jump off, start this conversation just by talking about Tommy Robinson for a second. He's been today denied his appeal against his 18th-month prison sentence, where he's in solitary confinement, which I think it's being claimed that it's making him ill, which makes a lot of sense. People don't tend to do very well in solitary confinement. There's a great number of Islamists and literal terrorists who've committed atrocities, who are able to sort of walk around freely in their sort of prison while they're serving their prison sentences, play their video games, have TVs. I think Tommy Robinson isn't even allowed to have a TV. So aside from the severity of his great crime, which was showing a video, there is a reason why he's being kept in solitary confinement. And that reason is if he was exposed to the general population, the general prison population, he would probably be murdered. What is going on in Britain's prisons that makes that an inevitability?
So it's worth noting that thanks to Jack Hadfield's reporting on this live from the trial, we know that the one of the witnesses brought to the stand for their expertise had refused to refer to Robinson's treatment as solitary confinement and instead just referred to it as segregation, but they didn't say why. And even though they admitted it was having an adverse effect on his mental health, including that he's got an ADHD diagnosis, and that the last time he was in solitary confinement, when he was locked up, I think in 2018, he lost a lot of weight and became profoundly depressed, so there is a risk of suicidality here. There was no thought as to change his conditions, but they didn't admit why. And the reason is, when he was housed in Belmarsh, now I think he's in HMP Woodhill, a disproportionate number of our prison population is Muslim. So according to the census, Muslims are 6.5% of the official population per 2021. They're currently 18% of the total prison population. So that's a 3 times overrepresentation. And it's a 323% increase since 1997. And that's bearing in mind that Islamist terrorists are responsible for 94% of deaths and 88% of injuries in terror attacks since 1999. They are 80% of counter-terror and 75% of MI5's open caseload. And despite suicide bombings, because obviously you can't lock up a corpse, they are 63% of terrorists in prison. In Belmarsh, where Robinson was just now, before being moved to his current prison, the last time they released their prisoner stats was 2019, and then 18% of inmates were Muslims. And these include infamous Islamist terrorists like Abu Hamza and Jem Chowdhury, both of Lee Rigby's killers, as Michael Alabalajo and Michael Adebowale, Motisu Chowdhury, the Parsons Green bomber, Ahmed Hassan, and until recently, until around 2020, Hashim Abedi. Now, Hashim Abedi is the brother of the Manchester arena bomber Salman Abedi, who killed 22 girls in 2017 by detonating a nail bomb in a pressure cooker at an Ariana Grande concert and wasn't stopped, unfortunately, because a guard was too afraid of being called racist to call him up on it. Hashim Abedi helped his brother build the bomb, funnily enough, using the housing benefits that the family were given, even after the mother had moved back to Libya in 2016, after both their parents had been given in 1993 asylum to come over to Libya. And then both parents moved back 1 month before the bombing in 2017 to Libya and have refused to cooperate with the inquiry. Anyway, so Hashim Abedi was in Belmarsh in 2020 until he attacked some of his prison officers. And he was moved to HMP Frankland. In HMP Frankland last week, he then attacked 3 other prison officers, throwing hot oil at them and stabbing 2 with a makeshift knife. So 1 female prison officer has been discharged from hospital, 2 male officers still remain in hospital with their stab wounds being treated. And you might think, well, hang on a minute. How did he get access to hot oil and a knife? It's because this demented Islamist terrorist, who has already had 3 years and 10 months tacked onto his sentence after committing an attack on his guards in Belmarsh, notorious lockup for Islamist terrorists as well, and moved to a new prison, he was given kitchen privileges. Even this extra sentence clearly is not a deterrent for these demented Islamists that Britain is packing into its prisons. And the reason that more time in prison is not a punishment is because Britain's prisons are basically madrasas now. In April in 2024, the Mail was reporting how British prisoners are subjected to forced conversions, they're subjected to forced Quran readings, or they have hot oil poured on them and they're tortured. 1 in 5 Muslim inmates is now a white convert, so they actually convert to Islam while in prison to join essentially a prison gang. And the largest gang in Britain's prisons are called the Muslim Brotherhood. Not to be confused with the actual Muslim Brotherhood, though judging by the fact that they're all called Muhammad, they're not very creative with naming.
Some overlap.
Yeah, at least in ideology. So we know that this is a recruiting ground, and the reason we know this is because in Belmarsh there were 3 Islamist terrorists who met in Belmarsh, called themselves the 3 Musketeers, and plotted to kill MPs when they were let out, and then were all re-incarcerated. One Muslim inmate himself said in 2016 that Belmarsh, and this is the maximum security wing, so this is meant to be the safest place to hold these people, is, quote, like living in a jihadi training camp.
So this is a breeding ground for Islamists, and if you don't subscribe to this ideology, you are either you are brought along by force, and it's a protection racket, right? So if you're in one of these prisons, you kind of have no choice but to sort of subscribe, sign up, and do whatever you need to do, convert in order to get protection.
Or it's not just a protection racket. The government knows that this is going on. Robert Jenrick's done a fantastic, Shadow Justice Minister, fantastic thread on this ever since the Abedi attack. They know it's going on, and so they outsource punishment for their political enemies to these prison gangs. And I have reason to believe this because Sky News correspondent Martin Brunt, he's the crime correspondent, said last year during the Southport coverage, quote, "Somebody who told me, somebody who knows about these things, they said that any right-wing, far-right protesters landing up in jail can expect a very cold reception in jail from what he says are Asian gangs inside prison who are looking out for them." Now, I don't think these Asian gangs are Sikhs, Vietnamese, Japanese, mainly because they're vastly underrepresented in the prisons. Though actually, I think the Vietnamese might be overrepresented as a share of population, but the gangs aren't. What he means are these Muslim gangs, the Muslim Brotherhood. And so if you have a prime minister sitting there and saying, these are all far-right Islamophobic racists about, I don't know, the people that were pretty pissed off when a second-generation Rwandan migrant stabbed a bunch of children and murdered 3 in a Taylor Swift dance class, the Prime Minister is putting a target on their back and then just throwing them to the wolves. And then you get situations like 61-year-old grandfather Peter Lynch, who did nothing violent, was engaged in non-violent protest at the scene of what became a violent riot in Rotherham, where some other people unrelated to Lynch tried to set fire to an asylum hotel. Lynch was thrown in prison, grandfather, heart condition, and we're waiting for the coroner's report, but it looks like he hung himself in prison. Why would that be? Well, because he was put in general population where all of these gangs are, smeared as a far-right racist by the Prime Minister, and anyone locked up for those racially aggravated protesting offences around the time would have a target on their back by these gangs. And so unless you're Robinson and you're kept in, no matter your thoughts on the prudence of his activism, inhumane conditions where you're living off a tin of tuna and not seeing any sunlight in solitary confinement for months on end, unless you're willing to be subjected to those conditions, your life is at risk. So I'm not shocked that Peter Lynch probably took his own.
That's interesting. I'd actually not considered that before as one of the reasons why he would have done that, just purely sort of out of fear. I mean, it's a very depressing case. Like you said, grandfather, I think he was holding up a sign which was, it said, or shouting to the police, saying, you are the reason, you're traitors, you're the reason why these vulnerable girls are being raped. And yeah, exactly. And then obviously he was put in jail for being part of the disorder, and I think the judge had very harsh words for him. You've let everybody down, you've let your community down, you've let your family down, and then being in prison at that age, I imagine, is a very depressing thing, and it could very likely lead to somebody committing suicide. But this is another aspect which I hadn't considered, and so thank you for raising that. Along with that, he was very likely to have been fearful for his life because there are these Islamist gangs who, and he has a target on his back. So there's been 1,804 arrests as of January, and 1,072 charges. I imagine there's more now, but this is a lot of people that are potentially going to prison for off the back of these riots last year and the sort of disorder. And these are all people potentially with targets on their backs.
More than have been in prison for the Rotherham rape gangs. It's worthy of noting, as Charlie Peters crunched the numbers, sadly, last week. I wrote for Courage about how the prison system is run in a Soviet fashion because Solzhenitsyn pointed out that the gulags were staffed by the sorts of people that were imprisoned under the Tsarist regime, who, under Marxist philosophy, were presumed to be wrongly imprisoned by a capitalist hierarchy. And so this meant that the murderers, the rapists, and the thieves had the run of the place. And so, if the prison gangs are allowed to conduct these forcible conversions and enact vigilante justice on people the Prime Minister calls far right, we are looking at a politicised gulag system operating in the UK. And just sheer demographic numbers will mean that prison guards are overrun by these gangs. And thanks to Juice 1882 on Twitter, he has done a demographic breakdown of this. So I would like to read out some of the prison populations by religion in this country. The number one is ISIS prison, would you believe it? 45.4% of the inmates are Muslims. Then we have Hunterco, 43.9%, Whitemoor, 43.5%, Feltham, 42.4%, Morton Hall, 42.1%, Cockenwood, 39.7%, Pentonville and Maidstone are tied at 37.9%, Woodhill, 37.7%, Long Martin, that is 37.4%, Mount, 33%, and Belmarsh at 31.9%. Reminder, officially, Muslims are 6.5% of the population. So what the hell is going on in British prisons? And also reminder, Belmarsh and Woodhill were where Tommy Robinson was being held. Are we really thinking they couldn't have held him in a prison that didn't have 30 to 40% of its inmates as the exact demographic that want his head on a plate? No. I think, just like the Attorney General made a bizarre intervention to bring charges against Robinson over X, personally for a civil matter, I think Robinson, Lucy Connolly, Peter Lynch, and everyone else in prison for those Southport protests and riots are political prisoners, and the state knows exactly the danger it's putting them in.
It's a terrifying thought, really. Yeah, I guess so. I think Tommy Robinson's sort of exhausted his chances for appeal by now. So I suppose there'll be more information coming out on how he sort of progresses in prison. Just on those, I was just curious for my own interest. You said there was 62% for people in prison for terrorism offences were Islamists, or were Muslim. 63%. Yes. I'm guessing the rest were sort of IRA, old school IRA, or sort of Irish
or far right.
A few far right. Okay, fine.
Which is curious because at the moment, ever since 2017, Islamist referrals.
So are they being?
But
I don't know if you have the information on this. But are those people? So, for example, those people who would be put in prison for their contribution to those riots last year, would they be designated as terrorists?
No, they wouldn't be charged under the Terrorism Act. They'll be charged under the Public Order Act, which is why adding a racial aggravation charge atop their guilty plea is giving them long sentences.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that figure of 63% probably does include some of the legacy terrorism which we've had in this country, which is no longer maybe some of the pressing issue. And probably in the last 10, 15 years, a lot of the terrorism has been even more skewed towards sort of Islamism.
Yes, and but the body that is charged with intervening to prevent said terrorists from committing those attacks, whether it's Ali Harbi Ali, who murdered Sir David Amess in 2021, or Axel Rudakabana, whose motive is still opaque. He was at least obsessed with Islamic terrorism, like the Manchester Arena and London Bridge attacks. And according to Robinson, while he was in Belmarsh, he saw him attending mosque. So that's something to throw into the mix. Prevent are just ignoring those cases. Ever since 2017, the peak of Islamic terror referrals, around the same time as the Manchester Arena bombing, when the same unit that governs Prevent, Raiku, told the entire country don't look back in anger because they didn't want us to get upset at Muslims for this terror attack. The referrals for Islamism have dropped. They've been outpaced by the far right, and now the predominant motivator for Prevent referrals is unknown. Like just mental health or other family issues. And so this big opaque box, as William Shawcroft said in his review of Prevent, allows people to carefully circumnavigate Islam as a motivating and compounding ideology for terror while still making referrals. But because they're squeamish about Islam, people are going unreferred and slipping through the net, like Rudakabana, like Ali Harbi Ali, and going on to kill people.
Right, so you'll have these sort of Islamists who are motivated by their sort of religious ideology, who then get designated as sort of mentally unwell, and they fall under that category. Okay, so now the Birmingham bin strikes, slightly different sort of topic, but I mean, it might sound quite absurd to anybody listening from overseas, but in the second biggest city in this country, there's 17,000 tons of uncollected rubbish, which has just been rotting on the street for weeks. There's sort of huge mutant rats running around, like you couldn't make this stuff up. I think army logistics have been called in to sort of assess the situation and maybe try and help. Essentially, the union of dustbin men, bin collectors, garbage collectors, have said that we're all going on strike because the council is sort of removing waste recycling and collection officer roles. They're sort of cutting some salaries in certain places by as much as £8,000
for 150 members.
For 150 members, and so the bin men, and these are guys who do actually it's not a nice job, right? It's a hard job, and they get paid.
Commendable job.
It's a commendable job. It's almost like one of the foundations of civilization. You walk outside, there are clean streets, and there is a sewage system, and then everything else works on top of that. So I find it quite hard to sort of overly criticize people who work in these kind of professions because they're so useful. But they've gone on strike, and now there's rubbish everywhere. The issue undergirding this situation is that the council, Birmingham Council, has no money. And the reason why maybe it has no money comes down to, yet again, to this insidious Equality Act. So I wonder what you can tell me. How did we progress to this point?
So, 2012, cast your mind back. 2 years after the Equality Act 2010 was passed, the UK Supreme Court, only 3 years old itself, ruled in favour of 174 claimants who were using the Equality Act to argue that equal pay disparities in the public sector were a result of discrimination. And they ruled in their favour, and they demanded that Birmingham City Council pay £1.1 billion in back pay and compensation, and another £650 to £760 million in still outstanding equal pay liability fees. Now, this suit was brought forward as a curious act of fate by a chap called Stephen Cross, is KC, and he just happens to have introduced a debate that I was part of about 2 weeks ago about whether or not liberal democracy is dying for these exact sort of reasons. And the overwhelming opinion of the audience was, shut that man up, we don't like what he's saying, as you'll be able to see from the clips that I posted. Cross, by the way, is also...
I think you were told to leave the country at one stage.
I was told to deport myself.
If you have so much to criticise here, you should deport yourself.
He asked me...
from an audience member.
He asked me, which country would you prefer to live in, and if not, why don't you move there? And what I should have answered to the rather curmudgeonly gentleman in question was the nice high trust Britain that you grew up in, which did not have bins overflowing, unless we're talking about the 70s and hence the sort of Thatcher revolution that came about because of that. Also, Stephen Cross is the brother-in-law of Christopher Steele, who was in the audience. So if the repudiation of the Russia collusion hoax was not cause enough for these people to reassess their worldview, nothing's going to get through to them. Anyway, I say all this because still, this chat brings this forward, brings the lawsuit forward. Equal pay suit is successful. Birmingham City Council goes bankrupt. At no point in this entire scenario, where now rubbish is stacking up in the streets, I heard it was as high as 21,000 tonnes, so who knows, someone...
But just going back to that point, this was a gender-based equal pay dispute,
yes.
right? So
between the bin men and then the cleaners and cooks who weren't even doing the exact same work.
There was an idea that within the sort of great body of people employed by the council, women were being paid a lot less than the men, because a lot of these were cleaners, or maybe they were sort of in office roles, and they were getting paid, somewhat less than people who are on the streets at 4 a.m. in the morning.
Are you noticing differences between types of job and saying that the pay should reflect the level of discomfort and danger? That's very sexist.
Yeah, we do have this strange mechanism to sort of, adjust and draw people into jobs that might be not necessarily comfortable or cozy.
That doesn't sound like equality to me. Therefore, we have to pay them equally, even if we can't afford it. And therefore, Birmingham City Council declares itself bankrupt. And actually, during the bankruptcy, they gave a Section 114 notice.
This is a radical move away from equal pay for equal work, for doing essentially the exact same thing. These were very different jobs.
Are you implying that communism was the goal? Yeah, of course it is. So under the Section 114 notice, they cited the equal pay ruling as the reason they've gone bankrupt. They're now making 300 million in cuts to council services. Hence why 150 bin men are going to be losing £8,000 out of each of their paycheck. And this is why they've gone on strike. Bin men are right to go on strike, frankly. The problem is with the Equality Act, Stephen Cross KC, and the ideological lawyers that bring these spurious human rights claims forward, and also all of the MPs involved, because this is happening in Birmingham. These are the constituencies of Birmingham Yardley, with Jess Phillips, who is more cared about quashing inquiries into Pakistani Muslim rape gangs so that she can keep her 693 vote margin and not be toppled by the Muslim vote than she is about rubbish piling up in her constituency. This is the constituency of Justice Secretary Shabana Mahmood, who's more interested in about delaying and dithering so that straight white Christian men, and probably Jews as well, can be thrown in prison at higher rates than black trans disabled Muslims. And also Tahir Ali, our favourite member for the right honourable region of Mirpur, who's more interested in building an airport out in Pakistan, in the exact region where most of the rape gangs come from, and in banning doing any damage or burning the Quran under a new blasphemy law, than he is about tackling the waste strike. The final bit of irony about this as well, as the rats run around and bite primary school children and attack private contractors that come in and collect the waste bags on camera in a sort of humorous video, I must admit, is that Birmingham City Council are planning to raise council tax by 7.5%. So the money's going to go up. Services are still going to be getting cut. At no point in this did they think about scrapping all of their diversity initiatives, and all of these equality laws are going to be on the books. The laws are going to get worse as well. This is the fun one for people. So Angela Rayner, Deputy Prime Minister, is going to bring forward an employers' rights bill that's not only going to cause 25% of firms to make redundancies, but, as I spoke about on Talk this morning, it's going to make pub landlords liable to be sued if their employees overhear conversations from people in the pub that they deem grossly offensive about their politics, their religion, or their identity. So pubs are going to become censorship zones. Otherwise, they're going to be shut down. Price of energy is already putting them all out of business. One pub, try not to laugh, in Enfields, called The Goat, is being taken over as a Kurdish community centre. So it's mosque.
Because it's gone out of business.
Because it's gone out of business. So more pubs are going to go out of business and be taken over as, bastions for diversity, community centres, whatever these mean. And then Labour is also proposing to bring forward, as they did in their manifesto, the Race Equality Act. So we've already got the Equality Act. Now they're going to enshrine this equal pay precedent specifically for race in law. So that means that all of these new care workers and cleaners that were brought over as part of the Boris wave can say, oh, I'm paid minimum wage, but hang on a minute, if you add up all the tally of the CEOs in the care sector, all men, they're making millions. I should be paid the same. So it's going to bankrupt everything. And that's in the private sector as well. So far, this equal pay dispute has been confined under the public sector equality duty purely to the public sector, which we know is ideologically bastardized as is. They're going to try and roll this out across the entire economy. It's just race communism, plain and simple.
Yeah, you do have to wonder when you look at these situations whether it's just pure idiocy, complacency,
Maybe
misunderstanding, or whether there is something a bit more sinister going on. Whether there is an end goal which is opaque, or maybe it's actually not even that opaque, and it's quite obvious. But certainly, it's very worrying to hear that the sort of bastion of English civilization, which is the pub and the freedom of association associated with that. I mean, this is where all the sort of important conversations and meditations on the news of the day happens after work. Is sort of under threat.
That's exactly why, though. They're behaving like all of our pubs are Munich beer halls in 1923, and they're going to be hotbeds of sedition, or like a sort of pub in Alexandria, Virginia, in the 18th century, where revolution will be started. No, what is actually happening is working Brits are getting together after work to discuss the sorry state of their country over an overpriced pint. And that's what the government can't abide by. Because if you do not feel isolated, if you do not feel that you are the crazy one, if you can gather together in a social group in the last bastion for the working man and say, this really isn't on, is it? And exercise your ability to speak freely in the 4 to 5 years between elections when you can actually do anything about the government that's ruining your country, well, then an opposition might organise against them. And that would be very, very inconvenient for people that have a vested interest in, for whatever reason, decimating the peace and prosperity that we've had for decades.
Maybe they're just hoping to sort of catch Nigel Farage in a very inconvenient moment while he's doing one of his pint-pulling PR stunts, saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. Okay, moving on now, just very briefly at the end, to this Home Affairs Select Committee report, which has just come out. So Parliament's cross-party Select Committee, Home Affairs, has just released a report which claims that these claims of two-tier policing of the riots, summer riots last year in 2024, were baseless. That there wasn't any difference between how these riots were policed and how these people who came out to protest the murder of those, the horrific murder of those girls at the Taylor Swift dance party, these guys were not policed any differently to others who engage in similar types of disorder.
We've investigated ourselves and we've cleared ourselves of all charges.
Well, I mean, is that the case? These are a group of MPs who have put together this report, and this is the conclusion that they've reached. Do we trust it? Should we trust it?
Okay, so
is there any reason to? Is there any reason not to?
Curious that Bel Ribeiro Addy, one of the MPs on the Home Affairs Select Committee, Labour MP, of course, who doesn't want to make her party look very bad, has been sounding off for years now about how the British police are institutionally racist because, for example, black suspects make up 73% of the Met Police's gang member index. And
despite being 13% of the population, roughly?
Yeah, but if that, because of course it's young black men between the ages of about 14 and 40. Right. So it's an even thinner slice. Okay. It's not black babies or elderly black women doing lots of stabbing at Notting Hill Carnival, is it?
After church.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's not most of my Catholic congregation in South East London that are just hacking at each other with machetes. Let's be precise here. But she's said ever since the death of George Floyd, across the pond, under questionable circumstances, that the British police are ineradicably racist and mistreat minorities really, really badly. But as soon as the targets are white working class people who spontaneously erupt into outrage in Labour areas that have been disproportionately afflicted by the Pakistani rape gangs, after a second generation Rwandan murders 3 children and stabs a bunch more, suddenly the police did absolutely nothing wrong, I'm sure of it. The other person that's noteworthy in this, Sean Davies, that we discussed before, former head of Telford Council, now the Telford MP, Labour MP, who in 2016 went out of his way to write to the then Home Secretary, saying that a local inquiry into the rape gangs in Telford was not necessary. that the claims were entirely overblown. Now, this is despite Tom Crowther KC in 2022, when the Telford inquiry actually happened and the report was published, finding among police and members of the council that sensitivities around community relations, particularly upsetting the Asian Pakistani community, had stopped people from speaking up about this. So yeah, there was explicit two-tier policing for fear of being called racist. And Sean Davies engaged in helping that to be covered up. But he's now insisting that there's no such thing as two-tier policing. The only thing that I will say about this report further, other than to read Sam Bidwell's excellent piece in The Critic on it, where he compares it to the Soviet Union's laughable Election Security Commission that just so happens to find that any time the Communist Party won, it was all tickety-boo. The last thing I will say is I believe Robbie Moore sits on the Home Affairs Select Committee. And Robbie Moore has been a fantastic MP in Bradford, trying to call for a local inquiry in Keighley and also a wider national inquiry. I think he should be speaking up about this a bit more, because I don't think he's sounded off on this report. I very much doubt that he's signed off on it. I would insist that he speak up about this. Oh, and the only other detail that was contained in there was that the local police, Merseyside Police, had admitted in this report to withholding certain bits of evidence about Axel Rudakabana's identity. And they had considered pushing the narrative that his family had a Christian background, even though he personally didn't, to counteract claims that this had anything to do with Islam because of the riot that erupted after the vigil around a mosque in Southport. So it's the acknowledgement that they were trying to gaslight the public to reduce blowback on Muslims.
So it's another example of a really careful and sophisticated manipulation of the public and the public's response to these sort of heinous crimes as they pop up and occur, in order to sort of quell feeling and maybe then action in response. I think it is sort of worth noting that Britain is a fairly as countries go, a fairly peaceable one. You know, we don't have, but even still today, like we don't have masses of riots all the time, on our streets. But every now and then, sort of disorder does crop up. When that does occur, whatever community it is that flares up in passion over something that has happened, the immediate response in the media and among our political class seems to be to invite the nation to sort of contemplation and meditation on what the root causes of this might be. You know, that actually this disorder has presented itself as a kind of justified anger in response to some form of inequality or some disparity or something. But when it is sort of working class in this country who have sort of burst into outrage over the exploitation, abuse, murder of the most vulnerable among them, sort of no such dignity is afforded to them. And that's not an example of two-tier policing, but it's an example of like a sort of two-tiered response and sort of a lack of generosity to these people. And that is to say, people should not go out and disturb the king's peace. They shouldn't go out and riot. They should obey the law. But you can see why these people in particular, particularly in some of these towns, would be so frustrated and take their anger out in this way.
Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner did a photo op kneeling for George Floyd. Then the Met Police, during the 2023 and 2024 weekly, weekend and Wednesday, pro-Palestine, pro-Hamas marches throughout Westminster, after chants of From the River to the Sea, Intifada and Jihad were caught on camera, the Met Police said on Twitter, well, the term jihad has a lot of meanings. We know you might associate it with terrorism, and then engaged in an extolling of Islamic scholarship from the Met Police. It just so happens, by the way, that a Met Police advisor had to be sacked because he had praised Hamas. So there is explicitly apologetics engaged in for minority grievance groups and their associated activist organizations that speak on their behalf. Meanwhile, if the indigenous population get upset when girls are murdered, No such charitableness. In fact, the entire state marshals the justice system and magistrates' courts to work around the clock to slap racial and religious aggravation charges atop their public order offences, to put them away for a long time. And as we already said, put them in environments where extrajudicially their life is in danger. So the idea that there is no such thing as two-tier policing in Britain, just in that instance, is absurd. And the final instance I'll use, there's explicitly two-tier policing in the College of Policing's guidance since its inception. Non-crime hate incidents were invented in 2014, 2 years after the College of Policing was set up, because of the Macpherson report in the late 90s that said the police themselves are institutionally racist. So now the police go out of their way to police the private thoughts and speech of the public to prove themselves not to be racist. And non-crime hate incidents are only focused on protected characteristics. Those characteristics are defined by the Equality Act, which are minority ethnic, racial, and religious groups. So if you're a trans person, if you're Muslim, if you're black, you can say this person has offended me. And then the police are discouraged from engaging in what they would call secondary victimization, but what any of us would call asking for some evidence, before slapping a non-crime hate incident charge against someone who they don't have to notify and who can be blacklisted from public sector employment without their knowledge for the rest of their life. And all of that is done to, again, predominantly the indigenous, white, Christian and Jewish population of the UK, purely because the police don't want to be called racist. It's two-tier policing in action. It's been there for decades.
It's scary. I mean, with these non-crime hate incidents, sort of charges or notes, these are put against your name. Employers can see them. You may have no idea. I mean, I worked with somebody who apparently was had one sort of leveled against him. He was an MP, completely. I mean, it just completely sort of fraudulently, and he had no idea until he'd sort of put in a request for information about something else, and it sort of cropped up. So it's very insidious, and it's incredibly scary. Really? So you've checked
outside
because literally anybody who's literally listened, anyone who's watching this, actually don't want to give anyone any ideas, but anyone who's heard you speak about something which might be potentially controversial could just call up the police and make a complaint, and you could have one of these charges against you tomorrow.
As far as I know,
a crazy state of affairs.
Since October 2022, I haven't gotten a new one. I might well have one, but I haven't applied for public sector employment, because they turn away useless white men like me. But in October 2022, outside the Conservative Party conference, I was accosted by a police inspector who had misheard a conversation I was having with a local Birmingham activist who was complaining about another conversation that was happening next to us between a young woman and a Scottish preacher about abortion and LGBT issues. And he had misheard what I was asking her about, came over and said, "You've insulted this woman's sexuality. If you keep having this conversation, I'll arrest you under the Public Order Act of 1986. I got surrounded by about 5 or 6 officers, all on camera, by the way. There's footage of this, which you can probably see now in editing. One had a shoulder-mounted camera, like he was filming an ITV documentary, and stuck it at me. And I had to ask our friend Harry Miller over at Faircop whether or not I had a non-crime hate incident against me and whether or not I could take this complaint further. Fortunately, non-crime hate incident was not logged by the police, and complaint that we tried to process dropped, lost in the waste bin.
Imagine if the police brought that kind of fervour to just arresting sort of petty criminals and
or the rape gangs,
or sort of burglaries, bike thefts, phone thefts. We'd be living in a bit of a different country, I think.
91% of...
But they wanted...
This in Douglas's column a year ago. 91% of all the constabularies in the country have not solved a single burglary in the last year.
How much?
91%.
Right.
Not one
and
burglary.
It's not because there have been no burglaries.
Yeah, they just give you a crime number and tell you to get lost.
It's much easier to knock on people's doors and sort of harangue them for Facebook posts or Twitter posts.
With a couple of digestives and just log non-crime hate incidents against people.
It's terrifying. Okay, I think that pretty much sums up our discussion of those topics for this week.
Well, we can't complain about it in the pub, apparently.
No, I guess so. We'll just have to. So you'll be off and I'll be off, and but that's it. So thank you for listening to the weekly wrap with me, Luke Daniel, and Connor Tomlinson. See you next week.